If Pa kills Ma, then who kills Pa? Marwood. Now, Marwood, William Marwood, was the public executioner, and that rhyme was thrown around in Victorian Britain, said by school children or, well, anyone really. It was quite famous at the time. So today, I've come to the gateway to the Lincolnshire walls, to Horncastle, because this is where William Marwood spent most of his life, and this is where I'm hoping we're going to learn a little bit more about his story. Hanging has been part of Britain's story for well over 1,000 years. Its roots stretch back to Anglo-Saxon England, and while William the Conqueror tried to curb executions after 1066, favouring punishments such as blinding and castration instead, hanging was brought firmly back under Henry I. And back it came with enthusiasm. For centuries, public executions were treated as a day out. Families gathered, traders sold food, crowds squeezed together for the best view, and the condemned were often left to die slowly by strangulation after a cart or ladder was pulled away beneath them. Grim, absolutely. Popular, astonishingly so. The unfortunate soul holding the rope became known as the hangman, a word that still carries a certain chill today. But the man whose story we're following wasn't especially fond of that word. William Marwood, you see, did technically hang people, 179 of them to be precise, but he hated the word hangman. No, he much preferred the title public executioner. A subtle distinction perhaps, but quite a revealing one, because in his own mind, he wasn't simply a man carrying out executions. He genuinely believed he was making them more humane. Now that's not a sentence you hear every day. So, how does an ordinary Lincolnshire cobbler end up changing the way Britain hanged its condemned? Why were prison governors writing to him for advice? Why did curious Victorians travel miles just to shake his hand, buy a bootlace from his shop, or catch a glimpse of the man behind the gallows? And why did others despise him so much that, according to one enduring story, they may even have wanted him dead? This is a story of invention, contradiction, notoriety, and no shortage of moral grey areas. So let's walk in the footsteps of William Marwood and discover the man behind the rope. So hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. If you are new here, I'm Claire, this is the Wanderlust Way. On this channel I like to try and visit different places and find some of the more unusual stories associated to them and bring them to this channel for you. Each episode I do quite a lot of research for, so hopefully I'll be bringing you something you might not already know. Now if you want to subscribe, it is completely free and it is well appreciated by me. In the meantime, let me thank everybody that does already support this channel by liking, watching, commenting, sharing, subscribing, becoming members and sending super thanks and donations, because you're helping this channel to grow and you're allowing me to carry on doing what I'm doing and sharing these stories with you. That's enough waffle, let's wander. Our tale has to start where it actually starts, and that is the birthplace of William Marwood. So he was born in a small rural village in Lincolnshire called Goulceby. I think that's how it's pronounced. I'm sorry if you're local, if it's wrong, please do let me know in the comments. So William was born here in the year 1818 to what the reports describe as a poor family. His father was an illiterate cobbler, a shoemaker, and he spent those first years of his life as part of a very big family in this very rural village. Goulceby sits around 7 miles southwest of Louth and 20 miles east of Lincoln. Tucked away amongst the rolling hills of the Lincolnshire Wolds, its landscape, I imagine, has changed very little since the year 1818, which is when, of course, our journey begins, with the birth of William Marwood. It's peaceful, picturesque, and about as far removed from London's prisons and public executions as you could possibly imagine, which perhaps makes it all the more surprising that this quiet little village would produce the man who would go on to change the history of hanging in Britain. church. Now this is a really, really tiny little rural village, and the Church of All Saints, I believe it was originally on a site further down in the village, further down Church Lane. Now I'm going to go and have a look in a minute, but this was it was dismantled and rebuilt in 1908 to see the structure that we see today. However, it was inside this church that William was married, and so it would have played quite a role in his story, I imagine, as a child, that he would have known the church well. This is the church. It's absolutely beautiful, to be fair. Let me show you. William Marwood was born here in Goulceby on the 8th of November 1818. The son of William and Elizabeth Marwood. He was one of 10 children, so I imagine there wasn't much peace and quiet in the Marwood household. As a boy, William attended Sunday school here in the village, and his Christian faith would remain an important part of his life right until the very end. Which does raise an interesting question. How does a man with such deeply held religious beliefs reconcile a profession built around taking human life? That's something we will come back to again and again as this story unfolds. But his future wasn't always destined to revolve around leather and rope. William was originally apprenticed as a local miller, but after breaking his leg in an accident, that career quite literally came to a halt. And so his father taught him the trade of shoemaking and helped him establish a small business here in Lincolnshire. Very old. But yeah, just walking down this, I'm going to show you. Walking down the aisle, just imagining. It's very quaint, very small village style. Very peaceful, but also a little bit eerie because there's nobody here. On the 15th of February 1836, William married Jessie Lilly. He was just 17 years old, while she was several years his senior. It marked the beginning of a new chapter in William's life, and before long the couple would leave Goulceby behind and eventually make Horncastle their forever home, a move that, in more ways than one, would shape the rest of his life. Okay, so judging by how I see it, the church was further back there, so I've got it back in the car and I've come, it's about a minute away, and this brings us to the original site of the church. Now the reason I'm bringing you here is because there is a grave in this churchyard that associates to the Marwood family. Now it is still very, very rural, as you'll see. I've got some sheep behind me. If you come down here, there is a little map, and it's got the names of everybody that's buried here. So as you can see, Marwood is there, grave number 35. So it's not that far away, 37, 36. Oh, where is it? I don't know. Maybe it's completely gone now. Ah, here we are. It's there. So it's there, Marwood. It's right in the middle of that undergrowth over there. In 1908, All Saints was rebuilt on a new site, with parts of the original medieval church carefully incorporated into the new building, while the old churchyard remained exactly where it had always been. Now, if you wander into that old churchyard when the grass isn't quite so enthusiastic, you may just spot a weathered headstone bearing the name William Marwood. At first glance, you might assume you've found the grave of the man we're following today, but you'd be mistaken. This William Marwood was his older brother, who died at just 6 years old. When another son was born into the family in 1818, they gave him the very same name. Now, it might seem unusual today, but in the 19th century, when childhood mortality was heartbreakingly common, it wasn't unusual for parents to honour a child they had lost in exactly this way. It's a small detail, but I think it's a poignant reminder that long before William Marwood became associated with death, He was born into a world where death was already an all too familiar part of everyday life. Sometime during his 20s, William and Jessie left Goulceby and settled in the village of Old Bolingbroke. Here, William once again set himself up as a cobbler and also became a local preacher at the Wesleyan chapel. It's another side to his character that's easy to overlook. Long before prison governors were writing to him, William was standing in front of congregations preaching his Christian faith. By 1855, however, the Marwoods had packed up once again and moved to the nearby market town of Horncastle. If Goulceby was where Marwood's story began, then Horncastle is really where it developed, because it's here that he spent the majority of his life. And it would be the place that people would get recognise when they thought of him. If they thought of Horncastle, they would think of the Hangman. And it also brought a lot of people here. People would come and visit his cobbler's shop, especially during the August horse fair. Today, Horncastle is best known as the antiques capital of Lincolnshire, with rows of independent shops, antique dealers, cafes and pubs, giving it a steady flow of visitors. It's a town with ancient roots. Long before Marwood and his Victorian neighbours arrived, Roman settlers had already made their mark, and fragments of that past can still be found if you know where to look. But by the mid-19th century, at the time of our story, Horncastle was a well-established market town. Not a city, not even close to somewhere like Lincoln, but compared to the villages William had come from, it would have felt noticeably busier, more movement, more trade, more opportunity. It was on Foundry Street here in Horncastle that William and Jessie, husband and wife, now set up home. And they moved in with her parents at number 149 Foundry Street. Now, I'm not exactly sure, there is a 149 over here, but I'm not exactly sure if the numberings have slightly changed since those days, because I've read various reports. But if you're local and you know any more, do let me know in the comments. When William and Jessie arrived in Horncastle in 1855, they moved into number 149 Foundry Street with Jessie's parents, while William got to work building his shoemaking business. Along Foundry Street stood the town's workhouse, close to where the fire station is today, and I can't help wondering whether passing that every day served as a reminder of just how quickly life could unravel in Victorian Britain. One illness, one accident, one run of bad luck, and your whole world could look very different. If there's one thing that seems to crop up time and time again when researching William Marwood, it's that he wasn't particularly fond of sitting around doing nothing. He worked long hours as a cobbler, became well known around the town, and was said to enjoy organising races and games for the local children. Sadly, that chapter of William's life came to an end in July 1867, when Jessie died and was buried at Holy Trinity Church, a place we will visit a little later. Just 3 months later, William married Ellen Andrews at the Wesleyan Chapel on Queen Street, and together they moved a little further along Foundry Street to number 64. From the outside, it's another Victorian terrace. Inside, however, things become rather more interesting. The walls were said to be hung with biblical scenes, including the Last Supper and the Crucifixion, while the bookshelves were filled with medical texts. Not exactly what you'd expect to find in the home of a village cobbler, but then William Marwood rarely seemed to fit neatly into one box. Ellen later admitted she never really understood what first drew her husband towards the profession that would eventually define his life. One thing she never questioned, however, was his work ethic. William hated idleness, spent long days in his little cobbler's shop, and whenever he read reports of crime in the Sunday newspaper, he would simply remark, "Had they been brought up in the fear of God, they would never have gone wrong." Now, for William Marwood, religion and the chapel was supposed to be not just another building in life, but it was a massive part of his life. Now, from what I can tell, obviously it's abandoned now, but this is the original independent chapel. I think this is where that he would have worshipped. Now I'm going to take you to the new one in a second, which is on the same street. So we're on Queen Street in Horncastle. If anybody knows any more about this, let me know. I mean, I've looked at the dating. The new one's too new. This one's more likely to have been the chapel, but I can't understand why he wasn't buried here. Maybe it was too full. I'm not sure, but let's go and have a look. By now, it's probably no surprise to hear that William Marwood took his faith incredibly seriously. He was a devoted Methodist, a local preacher, and firmly believed that many of the men who eventually found themselves standing on the gallows had been led there by strong drink and idleness. In one surviving letter, Marwood himself claimed that 3 out of every 4 people he had executed had come there through alcohol. And I have to say, after spending far too many hours reading through the detailed accounts of those crimes in Derek Matthews' excellent book, The Gentleman Executioner, I couldn't help notice the same pattern myself. Time and time again, booze does unfortunately seem to crop up somewhere in the story. Mind you, history also has a habit of throwing in the odd contradiction, because some reports suggest Marwood himself enjoyed the occasional tipple. It's a little sliver of irony I'd like you to keep hold of, because we will come back to it later. But one other thing I found particularly interesting was just how much William's faith seemed to influence the way he approached his work. Several accounts suggest he believed that by becoming a public executioner, he was carrying out God's work, ridding the world of evil rather than simply punishing it. Now, if that's true, it also helps explain why he became so determined to improve the way hangings were carried out, a method that would change British executions forever. According to the Horncastle History and Heritage Society, William even preferred executions to take place on a Monday, because that meant he could travel on the Saturday, spend Sunday listening to his favourite preacher, and then carry out the execution the following day. I can only imagine the whispers outside the chapel on a Sunday morning. Oh look, there's Marwood. I wonder if he's praying for the souls he took this week. And that perhaps explains why, once news reached the pews about William's rather unusual second occupation, not everybody in the Methodist movement felt entirely comfortable with the arrangement. So, going down Queen Street now. I hate to see these old buildings empty. Right. So it looks like they had an independent Sunday school. This one behind me is obviously, I believe it's 1960s built, this one. But we're on Queen Street, so it's the same sort of location, this sort of area. It's as close as I'm gonna get, really. So this is the new one, Queen Street we're on, and that's the old one that I took you to. So not far at all. Behind me is the Church of St Mary's, which is an absolute delight to come into today on 30-degree heat. Nice shady spots around here. But some people think he might be buried here, but he's not. I'm going to take you to the burial site later. But what's interesting about St Mary's Church is that opposite it, you will find, and there it is. It's got a blue plaque. Let's try and get over there before the car runs me over. So the blue plaque says, Public Hangman 1872 to 83, William Marwood, cobbler's shop, studied the long drop. It's nestled between these two older buildings, very tiny, but you can actually see where the door would have been. That's obviously now a window. Shoemaking wasn't just William's trade, it was the family business. His father had taught him the craft years earlier in Goulceby, and now here in Horncastle, William was following quite literally in his footsteps by earning an honest living repairing and making boots and shoes. This tiny building was once said to have had a glass panel over the door with the words in gilt letters which read Marwood, Crown Office. Now, by all accounts, business was steady. He built a good reputation, worked long hours, and before long had established himself as a familiar face around the town. In fact, despite everything else that would eventually come to define his life, William never actually gave up being a cobbler. What I find particularly interesting is that somewhere amongst the leather, thread and boot laces, William's mind appears to have wandered elsewhere. According to Ellen, he developed a keen interest in medical science and over time began thinking about something very few people would ever give a second thought to. Was there a better way to carry out a hanging? I've now come to a place which is nicknamed Hangman's Corner, and this just goes to show that even before William Marwood became the executioner, the famous one from Horncastle, Horncastle already had a reputation for executions. And one of the reasons that William Marwood decided to do what he did, which was to bring the long drop method into the British capital punishment system, was because he was sick of seeing people suffering. The method that was used before was usually strangulation. Death took a lot longer, was a lot more painful, and he was, like we see in the exhibition, he was meant to be a religious man and he didn't like to see the people suffering. So that was his reasoning. And Hangman's Corner seems very relevant. This is where the public gallows, I'm told, once was. Today there's very little to suggest that this busy road junction was once a place of execution, but this spot, known as Hangman's Corner, is believed to be where Horncastle's medieval gallows once stood, with the last execution here taking place around 1232. It of course predates William Marwood's time in the town by several centuries. When he was living in Horncastle, anyone sentenced to death locally would almost certainly have been taken to Lincolnshire for execution instead. It's believed Marwood never witnessed a hanging before, but somewhere along the line, something clearly sparked his curiosity. He became determined to understand not only how hanging worked, but whether it could be done differently. To understand why, we first need to look at the method that has been used for generations. The earliest gallows were little more than a sturdy tree branch with a rope thrown over it. Later came purpose-built ones, but the principle remained much the same. The condemned would stand on a ladder, a cart, or the back of a horse-drawn wagon with the noose around their neck. The support was pulled away, and then came the waiting. More often than not, death wasn't caused by a broken neck, it was strangulation. In many cases, the condemned remained conscious for some time, gradually suffocating as the rope tightened around their throat. Contemporary accounts describe executions lasting 10, sometimes even 20 minutes. It was a grim business, not only for the person at the end of the rope, but for everyone witnessing it. In 1866, an Irish doctor, mathematician, geologist and priest named Samuel Horton attempted to change that. Fascinated by the mechanics of hanging, he devised a mathematical formula that calculated the length of the drop according to the prisoner's body weight. The theory was simple. If the drop was long enough, the force would break the neck almost instantly, rather than leaving the condemned to slowly strangle. And it became known as the standard drop. For most people, that might have been the end of the story. Not William Marwood. He believed Horton's calculations could be improved, and here in Horncastle, he set about trying to prove that. This area of Horncastle is known as Lindsay Court, and according to resources, this is the area that William Marwood practiced the long drop method. Now, obviously, he couldn't use real people, so he used Hessian sacks filled with various weights, and eventually, so I'm told, he went on to use like sheep and pigs and try and hang them. Now, obviously, some people would say that's really callous. Others would say that he was trying to find a more, a kinder way of executing. If Samuel Horton provided the theory, William Marwood wanted to test it. According to the research, it was here, and in an old canal warehouse that once stood where the library now is, that Marwood began experimenting. It wasn't guesswork and it wasn't luck, it was methodical. Drawing on his interest in medical science, Marwood refined Horton's original calculations and went a step further. He realised that the position of the knot mattered just as much as the length of the rope. Rather than placing the eye of the noose at the back of the neck, he positioned it beneath the angle of the jaw. The aim was to fracture the second cervical vertebra, bringing about unconsciousness almost instantly, instead of leaving the condemned to slowly suffocate. Remarkably, Marwood never published his calculations or the table he developed. He kept the figures in his head, treating them as closely guarded knowledge. It wasn't until July 1888, 5 years after his death, that an official calculation table based largely on Marwood's work was finally published. Now, whether you view William Marwood as a reformer, an inventor, or simply a man trying to make an impossible task less cruel, one thing is difficult to argue with. He hadn't set out to make hanging more common, he'd set out to make it less terrible. In 1872, at the tender age of 54, Marwood was eventually allowed to give his long drop method a go, and he went to Lincolnshire, where he performed his first long drop method execution. Now Lincoln's about 22 miles from Horncastle, so that would have been probably his closest place to go, and it was a success. Thankfully, it was a roaring success, and the governor was impressed, and it sort of grew his reputation overnight, really, that one moment. Eventually, Marwood needed more than a theory. He needed an opportunity, and that opportunity arrived in 1872. By now, Marwood was in his early 50s. He'd spent decades building a reputation as a cobbler, a local preacher, and a respected member of the Horncastle community. Yet despite all his research, calculations, and quiet determination to improve the mechanics of hanging, he had never carried out an execution. The man sentenced to death was 28-year-old William Frederick Horry, convicted of murdering his wife Jane after a marriage that had spiralled into jealousy, drink, and violence. If you'd like to know a little bit more about Fred Horry's case or some of the other notorious executions carried out at Lincolnshire, I covered several of them in a separate episode, and as a little bonus, that video was the one that featured in the Horncastle exhibition. Now, at the time, Britain's best-known public executioner was William Calcraft. And here's a curious little coincidence. Like Marwood, Calcraft had also started life as a cobbler. During a career spanning more than 4 decades, he's thought to have carried out around 450 executions, almost all using the old short drop method. Marwood believed there was a better way. So on Easter Monday, the 1st of April 1872, Fred Horry became the first person in England to be executed using Marwood's measured drop method. This wasn't simply a case of giving everyone a longer drop. Marwood carefully calculated the amount of slack in the rope according to the prisoner's build, taking into account factors such as their height and weight. The drop had to be long enough to break the neck almost instantly, but not so long that it risked decapitation. By all contemporary accounts, the method worked. Gone were the prolonged scenes of strangulation that had troubled Marwood for years. The execution was widely regarded as a success. Not that I'm suggesting everyone celebrated a man's death, but because those present believed unnecessary suffering had at last been reduced. Curiously, the rest of the country didn't immediately set up and take notice. Other executioners continued to use the old methods, and some newspapers didn't even credit Marwood with carrying out the execution at all. It would take the retirement of William Calcraft before Marwood's measured drop method gradually became the standard across Britain. The next stop on the trail is the Joseph Banks Centre, which currently running an exhibition on William Marwood. Now, the reason I found out about it is because one of the guys that's involved from the Horncastle and History Heritage Society has actually used a snippet from one of my previous videos, the one about Lincoln executions. So if it's only running until, I think, September. I will put some details in the description, but they've got a little bit of stuff that they've managed to gather. I would imagine creating something like this quite hard work, but they've got some artefacts in here from William Marwood himself, and of course, what a perfect place to have an exhibition, his hometown. So the exhibition has been put together by the Horncastle History and Heritage Society. They're a local charity that's been preserving and promoting the town's history since 1966. And it's immediately obvious just how much work has gone into this. Inside you'll find everything from Marwood's old carpet bag and his death certificate to property records, original letters, newspapers, Victorian pamphlets, and even a fascinating scale model of the gallows used at Newgate Prison, which shows exactly how the long drop mechanism worked through the floor below. Even the notice on the door gives you a flavour of what lies ahead, warning visitors that the exhibition contains references to Victorian values and beliefs and advising discretion. It's currently running here at the Joseph Banks Centre until September, before making way for the Society's next exhibition, and I will pop a link to their website below for the opening days and the times. Although it is only small, looking around all of this, what really struck me wasn't simply the collection of artefacts, it was the story they tell about how quickly William Marwood's reputation spread following that first execution. Prison governors began writing to Marwood asking for advice, sheriffs requested his services, while Marwood himself wasn't exactly backwards in coming forwards either, regularly writing to prisons to put himself forward whenever an executioner was needed. Thanks to Britain's rapidly expanding railway network, travelling from Horncastle to prisons across the country had become far easier than it would have been a generation earlier. As the years passed, Marwood continued refining what he always referred to as his craft. He experimented with different ropes, eventually favouring a thinner 5-ply Italian silk hemp, developed a brass eye for the noose, and constantly refined his calculations in an effort to make executions as swift as possible. One small detail I found particularly intriguing was Marwood's insistence that the condemned should face west rather than east, because according to several accounts, he believed those about to die shouldn't receive the traditional Christian ending of facing the rising sun, and this even influenced where he positioned the knot beneath the left side of the jaw. It wasn't long before Marwood's reputation stretched far beyond the prison walls. His name appeared in newspapers across Britain, and perhaps most surprisingly of all, he even found himself immortalised in Madame Tussauds. One surviving letter from 1879, now I didn't spot this in the exhibit, but I have heard about it, was written by Marwood in response to a prison asking for guidance, and it lists his well-practiced method. Number 1, pinion the prisoner round the body and arms tight. Number 2, bare the neck. Number 3, take the prisoner to the drop. Number 4, place the prisoner beneath the beam to stand directly under the rope from the top of the beam. Number 5, strap the prisoner's legs tight. Number 6, put on the cap. Number 7, put the rope round the neck tight. Let the cap be free from the rope to hide the face. Number 8, executioner to go direct, quick to the lever. Let down the trap doors quick. And a final footnote, no grease to be put on the rope. Now, reading that today, it's just striking how matter of fact it all seems. To William Marwood, it just sounds like a job, carried out with the same methodical precision he perhaps applied to making a pair of boots. Let's now go back to August in Victorian Britain, to the area around sort of the market square and the streets surrounding it, because this was the site of the largest, well, one of the largest, I think it was the largest horse fair in Britain. Thousands of people used to come from across Europe, across Britain, and the whole place would be taken over for about 2 weeks at a time. This went on for hundreds of years, so it was a really big thing. And lots of people, it's really good for local business, obviously. And there was one man, of course, one man of our story who took full advantage of the horse fair here at Horncastle. By the late 1870s, William Marwood was no longer just Horncastle's local cobbler. Whether he liked it or not, he'd become one of the best known public executioners in Britain. And that growing reputation didn't just follow him to prisons around the country, it followed him home as well. Every August, thousands of people flocked to Horncastle for its famous horse fair. Traders, farmers, dealers and curious visitors packed the streets, creating exactly the sort of crowds any shopkeeper would have dreamed of. For Marwood, it presented another opportunity. His shop became something of a curiosity in itself. Visitors called in hoping to meet the executioner, and Marwood rarely disappointed. So there's a sign up here and it says, "The horse statues situated here are a nod to the Horncastle Horse Fair, which was once the largest in Europe and perhaps the world. It was held from at least 1229 until 1948, although it saw its heyday in the mid-1800s. Imagine the bustle and the noise and the deals that these streets saw. Hundreds of horses were traded and visitors came from all over Europe with agents for kings, princes, army generals and the gentry flocking into Horncastle. It is easy to see why so many inns and beer houses sprang up all over town." By now, William Marwood's name was known across Britain, but that didn't necessarily mean everybody admired him. When news finally reached Horncastle that their local cobbler was Britain's public executioner, the reaction was mixed. According to one neighbour, people followed him through the streets shouting abuse, and on one occasion he even had to ask the station master for protection. Another account claims fellow passengers on an omnibus refused to sit beside him and threatened to overturn the vehicle unless he got off. Thankfully for Marwood, those feelings appear to have softened with time, and nowhere was that more obvious than at the horse fair. Every August, thousands of visitors poured into Horncastle, and many of them made a point of calling at Marwood's shop. Above the door hung the words "Marwood, Crown Office," while inside he displayed the very ropes he'd used in some of Britain's most infamous executions. One rope, we're told, had been used on Charles Peace, Dr. George Henry Lamson, Percy Lefroy Mapleton and Kate Webster. For sixpence, visitors could inspect what contemporary accounts described as his official paraphernalia. If that wasn't enough, Marwood was also more than happy to sell them a pair of bootlaces. Not because they were any better than anyone else's, but because people liked telling their friends that they'd bought them from Britain's public executioner. He even had his own business cards. It's a fascinating change in fortunes. A man who, only a few years earlier, had reportedly been jeered through the streets, was now attracting paying visitors from all over the country. So what do you make of this? Was William Marwood simply making the most of an unusual profession? Was he trying to avoid any kind of poverty? Or had he become one of Victorian Britain's rather morbid celebrity figures? So this is what's known as St Mary's Square. It's supposed to be the most pictured, photographed square in the whole of Horncastle, or street in the whole of Horncastle. And I can understand why, because just have a look at these thatched roof cottages here, absolutely stunning, and the church is beautiful as well. But here you will find a property with a blue plaque. Now it says on it, Hangman's Cottage, W.M. William Marwood. Now I couldn't find any historical evidence that he lived in this cottage, but William Marwood owned a number of properties which he managed to acquire because he was getting paid for those hangings as well as running his business, the cobbler shop. Now I believe this is an Airbnb. I had a quick look. It wasn't available on the day I'm here. However, quite an interesting concept. It was quite fully booked as well, so it just shows you that there are people interested in staying in one of the hangman's cottages. By the early 1800s, William Marwood had certainly done well for himself. Unlike many of his predecessors, he wasn't paid a fixed salary. Instead, he worked on what we'd probably call a pay-as-you-go basis. He received a small annual retainer from the sheriffs of London and Middlesex, but most of his income came from the executions themselves. Around £10 for each person executed, with additional payments if there were multiple executions on the same day. His travelling expenses were covered, and under the rule of the time, he was even entitled to keep the condemned prisoner's clothing. Combined with the income from his cobbler's shop, it proved to be a lucrative profession. Over the years, Marwood invested much of his earnings back into property here in Horncastle, eventually owning several houses around the town, including this one. From the outside, it looked as though William Marwood had built a comfortable life for himself, a successful business, property investments, and a national reputation that kept the requests from prisons arriving. But history isn't always quite as straightforward as it first appears. Now, by the early 1800s, William Marwood's health had started to deteriorate. On the 6th of August 1883, he actually performed his last execution at Durham on a man known as James Burton. Now, the execution, Marwood said, was fairly straightforward, but that is not what the papers said. By the time he was 64 years old, William Marwood was in increasingly poor health. Years of constant travelling, long railway journeys, and the pressures of the job had begun to take their toll. His final execution took place at Durham Prison on the 6th of August 1883. The condemned man was James Burton, a 38-year-old labourer convicted of murdering his young wife Elizabeth Sharp. Marwood calculated Burton would require a drop of around 8 feet, and as the prison clock struck 8, he pulled the lever. For a man who had devoted more than a decade to perfecting what he believed was a more humane method of execution, what happened next could hardly have been worse. According to several contemporary newspaper reports, Burton fainted at the very moment the trap was released. His body twisted sideways, his pinioned arms became entangled in the rope, and the noose slipped over his chin. Instead of a clean execution, Burton had to be lifted back onto the scaffold, disentangled, and dropped for a second time. Witnesses described a distressing scene, and later reports claimed he ultimately died by strangulation rather than from a broken neck. Marwood never denied that there had been a bit of a mishap. What he strongly disputed was the way some of the newspapers reported it, insisting that they had exaggerated events and given an unfair account of what had happened. Then came another accusation. Some newspapers insinuated that Marwood had been drunk at the execution. He firmly rejected this claim, telling reporters he had consumed nothing more than a cup of tea that morning. Yet it does leave us with an interesting contradiction. Earlier in the episode we heard how Marwood believed strong drink lay behind so many of the crimes he witnessed throughout his career, and yet records from an earlier execution show him claiming expenses that included 12 bottles of beer, 2 bottles of whiskey and brandy, a bottle of sherry and a bottle of port for the morning of the execution. Now, whether those drinks were all for Marwood himself, or shared with prison officials, or simply reflected the customs of the day, it's not really clear, but it's easy to see why the allegation gained traction. The Durham execution caused a national scandal. Questions were raised in the House of Commons, and Marwood was relieved of his duties while an official inquiry was considered, and he never carried out another execution. On the journey home to Horncastle from that last execution, it said he caught a severe chill. His condition continued to worsen, and on the 4th of September 1883, just 29 days after his final execution, William Marwood died. Behind me is the Church of the Holy Trinity in Horncastle. Now, this is where William Marwood's first wife was buried. And sadly, a few short weeks after that final execution, William Marwood himself died as well. And he is buried somewhere in this churchyard. However, curious hunters over the years have been picking away at his headstone so that now there is nothing left of it. So it's an unmarked grave. I do not know where he is. I do not know where his wife is, or subsequently his second wife either. However, the death of William Marwood was not the end of the story. William Marwood died at his home on Foundry Street on Tuesday the 4th of September 1883. He had been unwell for some time and, according to contemporary reports, died from inflammation of the lungs aggravated by jaundice. Rumours quickly began to circulate that he'd been poisoned by Irish sympathisers, fuelled in part by threatening letters he had received during his career, warning him never to return to Ireland. The speculation became so widespread that an inquest was held. But the medical evidence was clear. His doctor, his nurse and the post-mortem examination all concluded that William Marwood had died from acute pneumonia following a period of declining health. He was buried here at Holy Trinity Church in Horncastle. But that's not where this ends. Just over a month later, on the 6th of October, Ellen received a letter from Madame Tussauds requesting William's last suit, claiming he had promised it to them. Sadly, she would not be his widow for very long. Ellen herself died just 3 months after William, in the December of 1883. By the time of his death, Marwood had accumulated several cottages here in Horncastle. But with both William and Ellen gone, their possessions were dispersed at a public auction. It became an event in its own right. Crowds gathered as newspapers described scenes of what became known as Marwood mania. One of his execution ropes sold for 90 shillings, his Gladstone bag fetched 60. Buyers also bid on his carpet bag, cobbler's tools, spectacles, the sign from his shop, the rubber stamp used to print his business cards, and even a Japanese sword reportedly presented to him by an admirer. Even Nero, his faithful dog, found a new owner. It's quite extraordinary when you stop and think about it. The belongings of a Victorian public executioner had become collector's items, and they still are. Perhaps that's why William Marwood's legacy didn't end with his funeral. His name even found its way into the traditional Punch and Judy show, becoming one of the inspirations for the puppet show's Hangman character. Love him or loathe him, Marwood had become part of British popular culture. And there was one final indication of just how extraordinary his story had become. Within a week of his death, newspapers announced that Britain's public executioner was no more. Around 1,000 men are said to have written in applying for the vacant post. 1,000 applicants! It does rather leave you wondering what sort of person sees the death of Britain's most famous executioner and thinks, yeah, I'll have a go at that. Now, I'm not here to judge, I'll let you do that. And I know last time when we did the Pierpoint video, there were a few people in the comments that said, yeah, I think I could do that. But really, I mean, it is such a task. But I will say that the more I researched William Marwood, the less certain I became about him. Was he a deeply religious man trying to make an impossible job less cruel? Or someone who became just a little too comfortable with the notoriety it brought? So that is it. Thank you so much to everybody for watching the video. I hope you've enjoyed it. Let me know in the comments what you thought. Let me know what you think of Marwood. Bit of a controversial figure, I'm sure. So until next week, we're going to stick around in Lincolnshire for the next episode, and we're going to look into the very strange stories around here associated with the werewolf. So if you're interested in that, please make sure you're subscribed. Please obviously make sure you hit the notification bell so that you get that notification. So until next week, stay safe, stay curious, and don't have nightmares.